Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 95. Come, let us shout for joy to the Lord, because the Lord is a great God and a great King over all gods. Today, if you want to obey His voice, do not harden your heart as at Meribah, as on the day of Massah in the wilderness, there where your ancestors put me to the test. They tested me, even though they had seen my work. I was disgusted. I swore in my anger, they will not enter my place of rest. Psalm 95 is one of those psalms with a sharp shift in tone. It starts out full of joy and praise for an all-powerful God. But even if His people are pleased with Him, we must not assume that He is pleased with His people. Instead, it seems they need an extreme warning. If you want to obey, you must not follow the example of your ancestors. God says, "The ancestors tested me in the wilderness and did not trust me. In my anger, I swore they would die in the wilderness and never enter my place of rest. Do not be like them." This warning reminds the people that obedience matters. This is why we use the phrase, "Obey His voice today," to remember this psalm. In order to enter the Lord's presence, to enter into His rest of any kind, means we must obey His voice. Psalm 95 has two main sections, the Lord's welcome and the Lord's warning. The first section, the Lord's welcome, is full of joy. It invites the people to come praise the Lord, the God above all other gods. This call to worship begins with praise and celebrates God as the rock of salvation. This image of God as a rock is essential because it reminds the people of how God protected and provided for them throughout their history. Praise involves telling God about His character and deeds. This section describes the Lord as a great God, a great King over all gods. He is the one who created the farthest parts of the world, including both the sea and all the dry land. The language reminds the people that God is creator, so He has authority over the people of Israel, and also the whole world. This creator God is welcoming His people into His presence to worship Him. In the second section, the Lord's warning, the tone shifts. First from joy to solemnity, from the loud shouts of praise to a quiet, reverent bowing down and kneeling. This kneeling acknowledges that God is the Lord and they are the people underneath His authority and care. The image of the people as the flock whom the Lord shepherds reminds the people of their history with God, both the glorious and the shameful moments. In the second part of this section, the psalm becomes pensive or deeply thoughtful as it remembers the history that was not glorious at all. While wandering in the wilderness, their ancestors often grumbled and doubted that God really would give them what they needed. Once, they complained about not having enough water. Moses, in his frustration, disobeyed God and struck a rock to make water flow out. Because they did not trust God to provide, even in the wilderness, the Lord gave that entire generation a life sentence to wander in that same wilderness for the rest of their lives. They would never enter the promised land of plenty, though their children would. For those singing this psalm, the choice remains before them. If you want to obey the Lord's voice, you must recognize the bad example of the ancestors and choose to reject it. Hardening your heart leads only to rebellion and doubting the Lord. Psalm 95 is a two-part invitation. It begins with a joyous welcome that invites people to worship. Then comes a warning that worshiping God requires obeying Him. The ancestors failed to do this when they did not trust Him. God is the rock who provides. He's the rock of salvation, meaning a secure place where the people are safe. but he also provided water from a physical rock at Massah and Meribah. But he's a God who requires sincere worship. He requires that his people honor him as holy. Even Moses and Aaron lost the privilege of entering the promised land because they did not honor God as holy before the people at Massah and Meribah. In order to worship this God and King, the people must first obey his voice. Then, unlike their ancestors, they will be able to enter his rest. Some background information is helpful for understanding this psalm. Psalms 93 to 100 are called the Lord Reigns Psalms. Together, they celebrate the Lord as king, unlike many other psalms that celebrate David as king. This may have been written after Babylon defeated Jerusalem. During that time, there was no longer a king on David's throne. The book of Psalms and the entire Old Testament wrestles with how God could let Israel be defeated. But it is also clear that God still considered Israel to be his people, and he was still their God. Even without a human king then, the people still had God as their king, and they continued to worship him. Psalm 95 likely reflects this situation. The covenant between God and the people still continued. They continued to worship him and continued to trust him to provide. And the people recognized that God had requirements for his people. A king cannot be approached by just anyone. The story of Esther gives the most dramatic picture of this. Those who wanted to approach a king needed to meet his requirements, which meant obeying his voice. Let's also look at the term rest. The word rest means many things in the Old Testament because there were many hardships that made people want rest. In the Old Testament, the word rest is used when God acts to end human hardship and struggle in order to bring about peace and security. Here are some of the meanings of rest in the Old Testament. First, rest can mean the Sabbath. God created the Sabbath to give people rest from their work. It was a time for people to worship and enjoy the results of their hard work. Second, the land of Canaan. The ancestors who rebelled were not allowed to enter the land of Canaan. Living in that land would have been a rest from wandering in the wilderness. Instead of depending on God to send food and water by a miracle, they would have a land with plentiful crops and good rainfall. Third, the temple. Before the temple was built, the Ark of the Covenant stayed in a tent. When it was brought into the finished temple, its own wandering ended. The Ark was finally able to rest where it belonged, in the temple where God placed his name, living in harmony with his covenant people. Fourth, in later Jewish texts, such as the book of Hebrews, rest is also used for the end times. This is a final Sabbath rest, when all the hard labor people do will be over. God's people will finally be pure and can worship their God in complete peace and harmony. These different meanings of rest often overlap. As the book of Hebrews shows, this final Sabbath rest is not the Sabbath of a single week's work, but the Sabbath of the work of all humans forever. It makes sense, then, for a psalm with complicated poetic images to use the word rest in multiple ways. In the story of the ancestors not being allowed to enter God's rest, it clearly means the land of Canaan. But for the current generation, those actually singing this song, rest likely refers more immediately to the temple, the holy place where they would be worshiping that day. Only those who chose to obey God would be permitted to enter to worship. Now let's look at Massah and Meribah. Massah and Meribah are two Hebrew words that mean testing and quarreling. These were the names for a place in the wilderness where Israel put God to the test. When there wasn't enough water, the people grumbled and complained. They argued with Moses, who complained to God. God told Moses to speak to a rock and he would make water flow from it. But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses in his frustration spoke angrily to the people and struck the rock with his staff. This became the most well-known example of when the people did not trust God, but instead tested him. For the people, trusting God would have looked like asking for him to provide. Testing him looked like grumbling. For Moses, honoring God would have meant obeying him and speaking to the rock. He dishonored God when he spoke only to the people and he struck the rock. When Psalm 95 mentions Massah and Meribah, it immediately reminds the listeners of when the people grumbled and Moses struck the rock. The ancestors did not trust God or honor him. Now, the current generation must decide, will they follow the example of their ancestors, or will they choose to trust the Lord? In Psalm 95, God is the rock who provides. He's the rock of salvation for people who praise him. And he's also the one who gives people water from the rock, even when they grumble in the wilderness. But those who grumble then lose the privilege of the covenant blessings God has to offer. They cannot enter into the promised land and live a life of goodness, enjoying the results of their work in the land God wanted them to own. God has remained the same. He still requires that his people obey him, but he also offers them true rest. If they will choose differently from their ancestors and obey his voice, they will be welcomed into his rest. In this psalm, that rest means entering into the temple to worship. But that moment of worship was a preview of the much larger rest God offered his people, a life of goodness, worshiping their God and enjoying the results of their work in the land God had promised. Please note that this video provides only one coherent interpretation of the psalm. See our website for details on other interpretations as well, including where the Lord begins speaking in the psalm and how the word rest is interpreted.